I learned the hard way that love, the very thing that makes you feel like you're floating on air, can be the start of a never-ending fall. Imagine being pregnant with your beloved husband's child, only to have your father end your life right after. Good afternoon, my dear viewers. This is Grandma Martha, 78 years young, speaking to you from my modest home in Lexington, Kentucky. But the story I'm about to tell happened in the small town where I was born, Oakwood, right in the heart of America. A town that today is a tourist spot full of waterfalls and historic houses, but back in the 1960s was just a quiet place where everybody knew everybody, with its cobblestone streets and gossip that spread faster than wildfire. Before I begin my story, I want to thank all of you who are following my channel. If you're enjoying my story, please leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. It could be from your city, your state, or even another country if there are Americans out there. It gives me such joy to know that people from all over are listening to what this old woman has to share. I was born in 1947, in a time when girls barely had the right to dream. My father, Mr. Anthony, was a stonemason who built half the houses in town with his own hands. A hard-working man, respected, but with a temper like the devil. My mother, Mrs. Elizabeth, was a seamstress who made everything from wedding dresses to work clothes, always with a quality that women in the region admired. I grew up surrounded by fabric scraps and the smell of fresh mortar that my father brought home on his clothes after work. Our house was simple but decent. 3 small bedrooms, a living room, kitchen, and a backyard full of fruit trees that my mother tended as if they were her children. We were 4 siblings, me, the oldest, then Joseph, Anthony Jr., who everyone called Tony, and the baby Grace, who came when no one expected it anymore, almost like a retirement gift from my mother, who thought she wouldn't have any more children. Life was simple in Oakwood during the 60s. Girls from respectable families like me had a well-defined routine. Help at home, get basic education, because women don't need much schooling. Go to church on Sundays, and wait for a boy from a good family to court with serious intentions. Dating, engagement, marriage, children. That was the path already laid out for every girl born in town. I was different, too dreamy for my father's taste. I loved reading books that my teacher secretly lent me, and kept a collection of magazine clippings with distant places I dreamed of visiting one day. Paris, Rome, New York City, everything seemed so far from that little town where days passed identically, one after the other, like beads on an endless rosary. It was in this setting that I met John. Oh, my John, I still feel a tightness in my chest when I say that name, even after so many decades. He arrived in Oakwood in 1965, coming from Washington, D.C., which was still a fairly young city then. He came to work as an assistant to the town's only photographer, Mr. Gerald, who was too old to climb stairs or squat to find the best angles. John was different from all the boys I knew. He was 22, with black hair that fell over his eyes in what today would be called charming, and a smile that seemed to light up everything around him. But it wasn't just his appearance, it was his way of seeing the world. He had lived in D.C., had seen things that we in the small town only knew from photographs. He talked about cinema, music, distant places, as if they were neighbors living around the corner. We met at a church festival, the kind that brought the whole town together. I was 18, helping serve food at my mother's booth, when he appeared with a camera hanging from his neck, asking permission to photograph the festival for the local newspaper. "Would you mind if I took a photo of you serving desserts?" he asked with that voice that sounded like music. It would look beautiful in the newspaper, with that smile. I felt my face heat up immediately. No boy had complimented me like that, so directly. In our town, boys were shy, sending messages through their sisters or friends before speaking to a girl. "My father doesn't like me appearing in newspapers," I answered, lowering my eyes as I had been taught to do. "That's a shame," he said, without losing his smile. "It would be the most beautiful photo I've taken since arriving in Oakwood." From that day on, it seemed like I ran into John everywhere. In the square, after church, at the market when I went shopping for my mother. Always with a smile, always with a respectful greeting, always with those eyes that seemed to see beyond what everyone else saw. Our courtship began in secret, in a way that only increased the enchantment. Notes passed through my friend Catherine. Quick meetings when I said I was going to her house to study. Hurried conversations in corners of the square when I managed to escape the constant surveillance of my family for a few minutes. John showed me the photographs he took, told me about the places he had visited, lent me books that I read in secret, under the blanket, with the light of a candle that I had to quickly put out if I heard footsteps in the hallway. With him, I felt truly alive. As if until then I had merely existed, breathing and eating, but not really living. "One day I'll take you away from here," he promised during our secret meetings. "We'll live in Washington, maybe New York. I'll be a famous photographer, and you can read all the books you want, see all the places you dream of." I believed him. How could I not? Love has that beautiful and terrible quality. It makes us believe any promise, no matter how impossible it seems. 6 months after our first secret meetings, John finally gathered his courage and went to speak with my father. He dressed in his best clothes, borrowed Mr. Gerald's car, a blue Volkswagen that was the old photographer's pride and joy, and showed up at our house on a Sunday after church. My heart felt like it would jump out of my chest when I saw him standing at our door, holding a simple bouquet of flowers he had picked along the way. My father, always suspicious, invited him in with that cold hospitality that only someone from a small town understands what it means. Polite on the outside, merciless evaluation on the inside. "Mr. Anthony," John began, his voice firm, despite the nervousness I could detect in the way he held his hat. "I've come here with all respect to ask permission to court your daughter, Martha." My father, sitting in his special chair on the porch, the one no one else was allowed to use, looked John up and down as if appraising an animal at auction. "And why should I let my daughter court a stranger who doesn't even have family here?" he asked, without beating around the bush. "A young man who works taking pictures, who doesn't have land, who doesn't have a known name?" "Because I care for her, sir. I care with respect and with serious intentions. I'm saving money. I have plans to open my own studio soon. I can give your daughter a dignified life." The conversation continued for almost an hour. My father asking questions, John answering with a calmness that impressed me. My mother, always diplomatic, serving coffee and trying to smooth things over when my father became too harsh. My brothers peeking curiously through the kitchen door, giving me looks that ranged from mockery to admiration. In the end, to my surprise, my father agreed, with conditions, of course. We could see each other on Sundays after church, sitting on our porch, under the watchful eyes of the family. Once a month, John could take me for ice cream in the square, but we would need to return before sunset. And in 6 months, if the courtship continued, we would have to be officially engaged. It was little compared to what we wanted, but it was more than we expected to get. John left our house that day with a smile so big it seemed it wouldn't fit on his face. I floated around, helping my mother wash the coffee cups, but with my head in the clouds, imagining our future together. The months that followed were the happiest of my young life. John came to visit me religiously every Sunday, always bringing a little something, a flower, a book hidden inside his jacket that he gave me when no one was looking, a photograph he had taken thinking of me. Our monthly walks to get ice cream were planned in advance, each precious minute away from the family's eyes enjoyed to the fullest. Gradually, John even won over my father. He helped with small house repairs, brought news from D.C. that interested my father, who followed politics on the radio, showed genuine respect for his opinions even when he disagreed. My mother already treated him like a son, saving the best piece of cake for when he would visit, asking about his health, even making him a sweater to face the Kentucky winter. Then everything changed, my dears. In one of those quick meetings we still had in secret, now not because of prohibition, but to have some moments just for ourselves, without the whole family watching, John kissed me differently, more intensely, more urgently. We were hidden behind the old church, in a corner that nobody frequented at that time of day. "Marry me, Martha," he whispered between kisses. "I can't wait any longer." "But my father said we need to be engaged for at least a year," I replied, worried about the conventions that had been established. "I can't wait a year. I want you with me now, every day, every night." What happened next, my dears, was what happens when two young people in love lose their heads. I won't go into details because you're smart and understand what I mean. But that late afternoon, behind the old church, we crossed a line that girls from good families in my time weren't supposed to cross before marriage. In the weeks that followed, we met more times in secret. It was wrong. I knew it was. I had been raised knowing it was. But love has that strength that seems to knock down all barriers between right and wrong. John and I loved each other with the intensity of those in a hurry, of those who feel that time is passing too quickly and every moment needs to be lived with complete surrender. It was when my period was late. At first, I didn't pay much attention. It's nerves, I told myself. It's because I'm worried about wedding plans. But when 1 week turned into 2 and 2 turned into 3, fear began to take hold of me. I sought out John during one of our secret meetings, trembling like a leaf, barely able to get the words out. "I think I'm pregnant," I finally said, tears streaming down my face uncontrollably. "My father will kill me. He'll kill us both." I expected to see panic on his face, maybe even that he would suggest we run away from there immediately. But what I saw surprised me, a wide, sincere smile, followed by a hug that almost took my breath away. "That's wonderful, Martha. Now we have to get married soon. There's no reason to wait anymore." "But my father, I'll talk to him today. I'll say I got a better job in Louisville, that I can support a family, that I want to get married as soon as possible. We won't mention the baby yet, just after we're married." His confidence calmed me a little, but the fear remained there, rooted in my chest. I knew my father too well to believe it would all be so simple. Mr. Anthony was a man of honor, old-fashioned. For him, certain things were unforgivable. We agreed that John would talk to my father the following Sunday, after church. He already had everything planned. He would say he had received an offer to work in a photography studio in Louisville, that he had a place for us to live, that he didn't want to wait any longer to make me his wife. But fate, my dears, sometimes has cruel plans for us. On the Friday before that Sunday, 2 days before the big proposal, I got sick during lunch, a strong, sudden nausea that made me run outside. My mother, who had had 4 children and knew the signs well, looked at me with a mixture of concern and understanding when I returned to the table, pale and shaking. After my brothers left and we were alone in the kitchen, she took my hands in hers and asked, her voice low but firm, "How long have you been pregnant, Martha?" I denied it at first, of course. I said it must be something I ate, that I was too tired, any excuse that came to mind. But my mother just shook her head, those eyes that seemed to read my soul looking at me with a mixture of disappointment and concern. "Daughter, I'm your mother. I know that look. I know these symptoms. I'm only asking so I know how much time we have before your father notices. Because when he finds out," I broke down in tears then, confessing everything. How much I loved John, the secret meetings, the recently discovered pregnancy, his plans to talk to my father that Sunday. My mother listened in silence, her face increasingly serious. "Your father can't know, Martha," she said when I finished. "Not now, not like this. He would kill John, and then he would kill you." I thought she was exaggerating, that typical fear women of the time had of their husbands. My father was strict, yes, sometimes even cruel in his words, but from there to killing someone, it seemed too big a leap. "John will talk to him on Sunday, Mom. He'll say he wants to get married soon, that he has a job in Louisville. We won't mention the baby yet." God hear you, daughter. God hear you. But God, if he was listening, decided to look the other way that day. Because the next morning, Saturday, I woke up to a commotion in the house. Raised voices, slamming doors, my mother crying. When I left my bedroom, still groggy with sleep, I found my brother Joseph standing in the hallway, his face pale. "What happened?" I asked, my heart already accelerating with a bad feeling. "Dad found out about you and John," he said, his voice low. "Someone saw you behind the old church and told him. He left like a madman, took the shotgun. Mom tried to stop him, but you know how he gets when he's angry." I felt the world spin around me. My father had gone after John, armed, blind with rage. All the stories I had heard about men who killed for honor, all the cases that women commented on in hushed voices about girls who lost themselves and the boyfriends who paid the price. All of this passed through my head like a horror movie. "Where did he go?" I screamed, grabbing my brother's shirt. "We have to stop him." "He went to Mr. Gerald's studio, said he was going to solve the problem once and for all." I didn't think twice. Still in my nightgown, without even putting on shoes, I ran down the dirt road toward the center of town, where the small photography studio was located. People looked startled. Some tried to stop me to ask what was happening, but I ran as if my life depended on it. And in a way, it did. When I arrived at the studio, there was already a small crowd at the door. My heart froze in my chest. I pushed the people, desperate to get in, screaming John's name, screaming for my father, screaming for God. But it was too late, my dears. Too late. When I entered that studio, time stopped. I swear to God, it stopped. The noise of the crowd outside disappeared. The sound of my own screams vanished, and all that existed was that scene that would be etched in my memory for the rest of my life. John was lying on the floor, on a red carpet that Mr. Gerald used to photograph the town's brides. Except now the carpet was even redder, soaked with my love's blood. His eyes, those eyes that had looked at me with so much affection, were open, glazed, looking at nothing. The camera that was his pride was broken beside him, as if he had tried to use it to defend himself. My father was standing next to the body, the shotgun still smoking in his hand, his face contorted in an expression that mixed anger and a terrible kind of satisfaction. When he saw me enter, his eyes narrowed, and something changed in that face I had known since I was born. That wasn't my father anymore. He was a stranger, a monster taken over by a hatred I had never seen before. "John!" I screamed, running to his body, falling to my knees in the blood, trying to touch his already cold face. "John, please talk to me." But he would never speak again. Never again. 2 shots to the chest, straight to the heart. My father was always a good shot, prided himself on that during the hunting trips he took with friends on weekends. "Get away from that scoundrel!" my father roared, grabbing my arm with such force that it left purple marks. "He dishonored our family, dishonored you." "What have you done?" I screamed, struggling, trying to break free. "You killed him! You killed the man I love, the father of my child!" That's when the words escaped, without me being able to control them. The secret we had planned to keep until after the wedding, revealed in the worst possible way, at the worst possible moment. My father's face changed again. If before there was anger, now there was something worse, a cold, calculating hatred that chilled me to the bone. "Child," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous, "you're pregnant with this... "Yes!" I shouted, tears flowing uncontrollably. "I'm pregnant with John's child. We were going to get married. He was going to talk to you tomorrow. We loved each other." I didn't see the slap coming. I only felt the impact on my face, so strong that I fell backward, almost on top of John's body. My mouth filled with blood, a tooth loosened. My father had never hit me like that before. Spanks as a child, yes, but never with this blind violence. "Slut!" he shouted, and the word hurt more than the slap. "You've brought shame to our family. You're no longer my daughter." Everything happened very quickly after that. Mr. Gerald, who had gone out to get help, returned with the town sheriff and 2 deputies. My father was taken away, still shouting that he had done what any man of honor would do, that he had washed the family's honor, that John had deserved it. I stayed there, kneeling beside John, until someone, I don't remember who, covered me with a coat and took me away. I remember seeing John's mother arriving, a simple lady from D.C. who had come to visit her son that week. Her screams of pain when she saw her only son's body still echo in my nightmares. The rest of that day is a blur in my memory. I know I was taken home, that my mother tried to calm me, that my siblings stayed away, too frightened by everything that was happening. The news spread through the small town like wildfire. By the end of the day, everyone already knew that Mr. Siu, Anthony, had killed the photographer who had gotten his daughter pregnant. I spent the whole night awake, my eyes dry from crying so much, a huge emptiness in my chest where dreams and hopes had once been. Everything that John and I had planned, everything we dreamed for the future, for our baby, all destroyed by 2 shotgun blasts. My mother entered the bedroom in the middle of the night, her face swollen from crying too. She sat on the edge of my bed and took my hands in hers, as she always did when I was sick or sad. "Daughter, your father will be in jail for a while," she said, her voice trembling. "But in this town, because of the way people think, he won't stay in jail for long. These things," she hesitated, as if searching for the right words, "these things happen around here, and men protect each other. They say it was for honor." "What honor, Mom?" I asked, my voice hoarse from screaming so much. "What honor is there in killing a good man who just wanted to marry me? Who just wanted to make me happy?" She didn't answer, just lowered her head. And in that gesture, I understood that for her, raised in the same tradition, there might indeed be some sense in all that violence. It was a world of men, where honor was worth more than life, where a lost daughter was worse than a dead daughter. "You need to leave here, Martha," she continued after a long silence. "It's not safe for you in this town anymore. People will talk, will point, will mistreat you, and your father, when he gets out of jail," she didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew what would happen. My father, humiliated in front of the whole town, wouldn't rest until he solved the other problem, the pregnancy I was carrying. "I'm going to send you to your Aunt Josephine in Louisville," she continued. "She already knows everything, agreed to take you in. There you can have the baby, decide what to do afterward. And you, Mom? And my brothers? We'll be fine," she said, but her eyes said something else. "Your father, despite everything, won't hurt us. It's you he's furious with." That same night, with just a bundle of clothes and the little money my mother had hidden from my father over the years, I left home. My brother Joseph took me to the bus station, in the silence of dawn, to catch the first bus to Louisville. "Take care of yourself, sis," he said, hugging me awkwardly at the platform. "And the baby, too." It was the last time I saw my brother, the last time I saw anyone from my family for a very, very long time. The trip to Louisville was long and painful. Every bump on the dirt road seemed to remind me of the brutal reality that had fallen upon my life. Less than 48 hours ago, I was a young woman in love, with wedding plans, expecting a child from the man I loved. Now I was a fugitive, a fallen woman, as they would say in my town, carrying in my womb the child of a man killed by my own father. Aunt Josephine received me without asking many questions. She was my mother's sister, but as different from her as possible. While my mother was submissive, silent, my aunt was independent, had her own business, a small fabric store in downtown Louisville, and had never married. "Spinster," they called her, but she didn't seem to care about the labels. "You'll stay here with me as long as you need," she said, showing me the small room in the back of the house. "Nobody needs to know where you came from or what happened. Here, you can be whoever you want." During the first few weeks, I barely left that room. The pain of losing John was so intense that it felt physical, as if they had ripped out a part of my body. I cried until I fell asleep, woke up crying, spent my days reliving every moment we had spent together, every promise, every dream. The only consolation was the life growing inside me. In the darkest moments, when I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, I would place my hand on my still flat belly and whisper, "You are part of him. You are our love. For you, I will keep going." Aunt Josephine gave me space to grieve, but after a month, she gently began to pull me back to life. She invited me to help in the store, taught me about fabrics, about sewing, about dealing with customers. Gradually, I found a little peace in that work, in the daily tasks, in the routine that prevented me from sinking completely into despair. My belly began to grow, and with it grew a new kind of hope. It wasn't the same bright, naive hope I had before. It was something calmer, stronger, born of pain but determined to survive. It was when I was entering the 5th month of pregnancy, already adapting to the new life in Louisville, that the past came to find me in the most brutal way possible. It was a Wednesday afternoon, I remember as if it were today. Aunt Josephine had gone to the bank, and I was alone in the store, organizing some new fabrics that had arrived. The bell on the door rang, announcing a customer, and when I raised my eyes, I saw my father standing at the entrance, hat in hand, his bloodshot eyes fixed on my now visible belly under the loose dress. The fear I felt at that moment is indescribable. It was as if all the blood had frozen in my veins, as if the air had become too heavy to breathe. I instinctively backed away, looking for something to protect myself with. "Father," I managed to say, my voice almost gone. "What are you doing here?" "I've come to finish the job," he said, and there was a terrible calmness in his voice. "I've come to clean the shame from our family once and for all." He had aged 10 years in just a few months. Whiter hair, thinner face, eyes sunk in their sockets. But what scared me most was the lack of emotion. There was no anger, no hatred, just a cold, calculating determination. How did you get out of jail?" I asked, trying to buy time, desperately looking at the door, at the street where maybe someone could help me. "That sheriff is my godfather," he answered, taking a step in my direction. "Everyone understood that I did what needed to be done. They released me last week. And Mom? My brothers? Your mother is fine. The boys too. Grace asks about you, but she'll soon forget. She'll grow up right, not like you." Another step in my direction. I finally managed to move, circling the counter, placing it between us. "Father, please," I begged, protecting my belly with my hands. "It's your grandchild, your blood." "It's nothing of mine," he growled, and for the first time I saw a flash of the anger that must have been boiling beneath that apparent calm. "It's the child of that miserable man who dishonored my daughter. It's the living proof of our shame." That's when I saw what he was bringing hidden inside his coat. It wasn't a gun, at least not a conventional one. It was a piece of wood, thin and long, with a point that he himself had sharpened. It looked like one of those pieces left over from constructions, which he kept in the basement of our house to use for small repairs. I understood immediately what he intended to do. He wasn't going to kill me with a gun. He wasn't going to shoot me as he had done with John. It would be more personal, more cruel. He was going to use that piece of wood to hit the baby inside me, to take the life of my son before he could even be born. Panic took over me. I screamed for help, threw whatever was at hand, rolls of fabric, scissors, boxes, trying to keep him away. But he was stronger, more determined. He circled the counter with an agility that didn't match his age, cornering me against the back wall of the store. "This ends now," he said, raising the piece of wood. I tried to protect my belly with my arms, tried to dodge, tried to beg one more time. But none of that mattered to him. I saw his arm coming down, felt the sharp pain when the wood hit my ribs, heard my own scream echoing in the empty store. I don't remember all the blows. At some point, my mind mercifully shut down, taking me far away from that unbearable pain. I only remember fragments. The sound of wood tearing fabric and flesh, the metallic smell of blood, the taste of tears and bile in my mouth, my father's voice repeating words that no longer made sense to me. The last thing I saw before darkness swallowed me was his face, transformed by something beyond anger, beyond hatred, a kind of cold, methodical madness that executed what it considered justice without any trace of humanity. Then came nothing. A black abyss, silent, where neither pain nor fear could reach me. I fell into that void like someone falling into a bottomless well, not knowing if I would ever find the way back to the light. I don't know how long I stayed in that darkness. It could have been minutes, hours, entire days. I only know that when I finally began to emerge, when consciousness returned in confused flashes, I was lying in a hospital bed, tubes and wires connected to my body, the smell of antiseptic replacing that of blood. The first thing I felt, before even opening my eyes completely, was a terrible emptiness in my belly. Instinctively, my hand searched for the bulge that had become so familiar in recent months. But where there was once life growing, now there were only bandages, pain, and an absence that weighed more than any presence. I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry, too painful. A weak moan was all I managed to produce, but it was enough to alert someone who was in the room. I felt a gentle hand on my forehead, heard a familiar voice murmuring words of comfort. "Calm down, my daughter. Everything's fine now. You're safe." I opened my eyes with difficulty, blinking against the strong light of the hospital. When my vision finally cleared, I saw my mother leaning over me, her face marked by tears, her eyes red from someone who hadn't slept for days. She seemed to have aged 20 years since the last time I saw her. "Mom?" I managed to whisper, my voice as rough as sandpaper. What happened?" I saw the pain pass over her face, saw the hesitation, the fear of telling me the whole truth. But before she could answer anything, another question, more urgent, formed in my confused mind. "My baby?" I asked, and I saw in her eyes the answer that my heart already knew, but that my soul refused to accept. My mother just shook her head, tears silently flowing. She didn't need to say the words. The emptiness in my womb, the emptiness in my heart, had already told me everything. It was then that I realized I had lost not only John, not only the future we dreamed together, but also the last piece of him that remained to me. Our son who would never get to see the world. The sky I could see through the hospital window was an impossible blue, as if the world out there didn't know about the darkness that consumed me inside. How could the sun continue to shine? How could the birds continue to sing? My world had ended, but the rest of the universe continued indifferent, as if nothing had happened. "How long?" I asked my mother, who still held my hand, my voice a little firmer now that they had given me water. 3 days, she replied, adjusting the blankets over me with that care that only mothers have. "You lost a lot of blood. The doctors weren't sure if you would survive." Part of me wanted to ask why they had tried so hard to keep me alive. What was left for me now? John dead. Our son ripped from me before he could even know the world. My family destroyed. My own father transformed into a monster I no longer recognized. "And him?" I asked, unable to say the word father, not after what he had done. My mother hesitated, her eyes lowering to our intertwined hands. "He's dead," she finally said, her voice almost a whisper. "John's father, Mr. Matthew from D.C. He arrived when—" She stopped, took a deep breath, as if each word was too painful. "When your father was still there, with you. They had notified him about his son's death. He came for the funeral and to meet you. He wanted to meet the girl his son loved so much." The world seemed to spin around me, the white walls of the hospital undulating as if they were made of water. "John's father saved me? He heard your screams from the street. He entered the store and saw what was happening. He had a gun. Your father didn't see him arrive. He was too busy destroying me," I completed, the bitterness giving a metallic taste to the words. My mother just nodded, the tears returning to fall. "Mr. Matthew shot once. Just once. Then he called the ambulance for you, but it was too late for the baby," I concluded, feeling the emptiness in my womb like a black hole that threatened to swallow me whole. "For both of them," she gently corrected. "For the baby and for your father." A part of me should have felt something, sadness, anger, relief perhaps, but I felt nothing. It was as if all emotions had been drained along with my blood on that store floor. I looked at the white ceiling of the hospital, counting the mold spots that formed meaningless designs. "Is Mr. Matthew in jail?" I asked after a long silence. "No," my mother answered, and there was a certain firmness in her voice that I had never heard before. "The people on the street saw what happened. They testified that he saved your life, that your father was going to kill you too. They called it legitimate defense of a third party." Ironic, I thought. The same system that had released my father so quickly after killing John now protected the man who had killed my father to save me. Justice had those twisted ways, those paths that seemed to make sense only to those on the right side of history. "And now?" I asked, more to myself than to my mother. "What happens now?" "Now you recover," she said, squeezing my hand. "Get strong again. And then?" "Then I can't go back to Oakwood," I completed. It wasn't a question. "No," she agreed sadly. "People wouldn't forget. They wouldn't let you forget. Small towns have long memories. Mr. Anthony's daughter, who was dishonored by the out-of-town photographer, who lost a baby, who was the indirect cause of her own father's death. I would be forever marked, pointed at, whispered about. Doors would close, looks would follow me, whispers would accompany me to the grave. Your Aunt Josephine said you can stay with her in Louisville, start over here," my mother continued. "She wants you near, says you have a knack for fabrics, for sales." I shook my head slightly. I couldn't imagine going back to that store, to the place where I had lost everything. Every piece of fabric would remind me of the blood. Every shadow would make me see my father with that piece of wood. Every customer who entered would make me startle, expecting the worst. "I can't stay in Louisville," I finally said. "I can't stay near all this." My mother nodded, as if she already expected this answer. "I have a cousin in New York. Zoe. You don't know her. She left Kentucky many years ago. I wrote to her when everything happened. She said she can take you in, help you find work there." New York, the big city, the human anthill where no one would know my story, where I could lose myself in the crowd, be just another anonymous face among millions. The idea attracted me like a light attracts moths. Dangerous, perhaps, but irresistible in its promise of warmth and brightness. "When can I go?" I asked, and I saw the relief in my mother's tired eyes. She was afraid I would give up, that the pain would be too great to move forward. "The doctors say they need to observe you for another week. After that, if all is well, we can organize the trip." A week. 7 days between the hell I had lived and the purgatory that awaited me. Time enough for the external wounds to begin to heal, but not even a century would be enough for the internal wounds. "And you, Mom? And my brothers?" Her aged face contracted in an expression that mixed pain and determination. "I'll take care of your brothers. Joseph is already working, helping at home. Tony and Grace still need me." I didn't ask if she would come with me, if she would leave the town where she had spent her entire life. I knew the answer. My mother was one of those women who planted deep roots, who didn't abandon their duties, who bore the weight of the world without complaining. She would stay in Oakwood, face the looks, the comments, take care of her husband's grave, and move forward, one day after another, as she had always done. The days in the hospital dragged on like slugs, each minute seeming like an hour, each hour a whole day. The nurses were kind, the doctors efficient, but no one knew exactly what to say to the girl who had lost everything at once. Their words of comfort sounded empty. Their looks of pity made me feel even more alone. My mother came every day, bringing homemade food hidden in her purse, telling small stories from the town that seemed to come from another world, from another life that I had lived 1,000 years ago. Aunt Josephine also appeared, bringing magazines, a new dress for me to wear when I left, talking about the plans she had for me if I changed my mind about New York. In that week of recovery, I discovered that the internal damage had been extensive. Besides losing the baby, the doctors had to remove part of my uterus, destroyed by the violence of the attack. I would never be able to have children. I would never carry another life inside me. I was young, only 19, and already carried this perpetual sentence. When I was finally discharged, it was the end of July 1966. The heat of the Midwest punished Louisville, the dry air making my skin itch under the bandages. I left the hospital supported by my mother's arm, 20 pounds lighter, Aunt Josephine's new dress loose on the body that had lost not only weight, but also the curves of the interrupted pregnancy. I spent 3 days at my aunt's house, recovering strength for the long trip to New York. I didn't leave the room, couldn't look out the window that faced the street where the store was located, the stage of the tragedy that had destroyed my life. I ate little, slept even less, tormented by nightmares where the scenes of that day were repeated infinitely, sometimes with even crueler endings. On the eve of departure, while packing the small suitcase with the few clothes my mother had brought from Oakwood, I received an unexpected visit. Mr. Matthew John's father asked permission to see me. I hesitated a lot. What would I say to the man who had lost his son because of me? The man who had killed my father to save me? What words could exist for a situation as impossible as that? But something inside me knew that I needed that meeting, that closure, before leaving for a new life. I asked them to let him in. He was so similar to John that I felt a tightness in my chest as soon as I saw him. The same eyes, the same shape of face, even the way of standing, slightly inclined to one side. An older John, more tired, sadder. "Miss Martha," he said, his hat in his hands, his voice hoarse from someone who had cried a lot. I needed to see the girl my son loved so much before returning to D.C. I couldn't answer. The words got stuck in my throat, a knot that threatened to choke me. "John wrote to me about you," he continued. taking from his pocket a bundle of letters tied with string. Every week since he arrived in Oakwood, he talked about the most beautiful girl he had ever seen, the girl who read books hidden from her father, who dreamed of distant places, who had the sweetest smile in the world. The tears started to fall before I could control them. I hadn't cried since the hospital. It was as if I had dried up inside, as if there were no more tears to shed. But there, before that man who was a living piece of my John, the floodgates opened again. He was going to take me to Washington, I managed to say between sobs. We were going to get married, raise our child there. He was going to open a photography studio. I was going to learn to develop photos, help him. We had so many plans. Mr. Matthew nodded, his eyes shining with contained tears. He told me all these plans. He was saving money to buy a small house on the outskirts of D.C. He wanted to give you a dignified life, away from small-town gossip. We were silent for a moment, both lost in memories of who we had lost, of futures that would never be realized. I came to ask forgiveness, he said finally, his voice almost a whisper, for not arriving sooner, for not saving my son, for not saving your baby. You saved my life, I replied, feeling the weight of those words. A life that I didn't even know if I wanted to continue living, but that he had preserved at the cost of his own freedom. How can I thank you for that? By living, he answered simply. Living fully, as my John would have wanted. He loved you too much to want to see you like this, destroyed. Before leaving, Mr. Matthew gave me the bundle of letters and something more, a brown envelope containing some photographs. These are the last ones he took, he explained. They were in his camera when it happened. Mr. Gerald developed them for me. Thought you might want to have them. I opened the envelope with trembling hands, and there they were, images of Oakwood captured through John's eyes. The old church, the central square, the river that ran lazily around the town. And to my surprise, several photos of me that I didn't know he had taken. Me smiling at the festival booth, me reading sitting in the shade of a tree, me looking out the window of my house with a dreamy expression. The last photo in the envelope made me lose my breath. It was me, in profile, one hand gently resting on the belly that was beginning to show the first signs of pregnancy. My face had a serene, almost radiant expression, illuminated by the setting sun. On the back, in John's careful handwriting, there was a single phrase, "My two lives in one single image." Those photos and the letters were all I took with me to New York, besides the few clothes and the medicines I still needed to take. They were my treasure, my connection to a past that seemed increasingly distant, like a dream that fades upon waking. The farewell to my mother at the bus station was the hardest thing I had ever done. We hugged as if we knew, deep down, that it would be the last time. She cried silently, wetting my shoulder with tears that seemed to have no end. "Right when you arrive," she asked, adjusting my collar for the 1,000th time. "Tell me what New York is like, what the people are like there." "I'll write every week," I promised, knowing it was a promise that perhaps I couldn't keep, not because I didn't want to, but because each letter would be a reminder of everything I had lost, of everything I had left behind. "I love you, my daughter," she said, hugging me one last time before the bus driver announced the departure. "Never forget that. Never forget that I love you more than anything in this life." The bus departed at dawn, cutting through the darkness of the Midwest like a fish cuts through the waters of a river. Sitting next to the window, I saw Louisville being left behind, its lights diminishing until they became just distant dots, and then nothing. Ahead of me, the road stretched like an uncertain invitation, leading to a future that I couldn't imagine. I was 19, my body still in pain, my heart in pieces, and I was leaving alone for the biggest city in the country with nothing but a small suitcase, some photographs, and an emptiness in my chest where hope had once been. I didn't know what awaited me in New York. I didn't know if I would find the strength to start over, if the pain would one day diminish enough to allow me to breathe without feeling like I was drowning. The only certainty I carried was that I couldn't go back. The past had been sealed with blood, with death, with irreparable losses. All that remained was to move forward, one foot in front of the other, one day after another, carrying the weight of memories that no distance would ever erase. I rested my head against the cold glass of the bus window, observing the stars that dotted the infinite sky of the central United States. Somewhere up there, I thought. Perhaps John was watching over me. Perhaps our son, who didn't even get to know the world, was safe in his arms. It was a silly thought. Childish, perhaps. But at that moment of absolute solitude, it was the only comfort I could find. The road continued, relentless, taking me to a destiny I hadn't chosen, to a life I had never imagined, to a world where I would have to learn to exist being only half of who I once was. The bus continued, swallowing miles in the darkness, and I continued inside it, a passenger on the way to the unknown, leaving behind what remained of the girl who once dreamed of love, family, and happiness. New York swallowed me like a beast devours its prey. The Port Authority bus terminal, where I got off after almost 24 hours of travel, seemed like a human anthill. People running everywhere, incomprehensible announcements on the loudspeaker, strange smells, noises I had never heard before. I stood in the middle of that confusion, holding my worn suitcase, my body still in pain, feeling smaller than an ant. "Miss, are you going to stand there all day?" shouted a taxi driver, startling me. "Are you looking for someone?" I handed him the crumpled paper with my mother's cousin's address. The man looked, made a face, and pointed to a city bus. "Take that one. Get off at the last stop. Far neighborhood, a taxi would charge you an arm and a leg." That's how New York was in 1966. Direct, hurried, no time for small-town courtesies. I followed the instruction in a trance, getting on the crowded bus, grabbing onto whatever I could while the vehicle snaked through endless avenues, through neighborhoods that seemed like entire cities, through a concrete labyrinth that seemed to have no end. Zoe's house was in the outskirts of the East Bronx, in a neighborhood called Throg's Neck. A simple construction squeezed between so many others identical to it, on a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained. She received me with the distrustful hospitality typical of those who live in the big city. A quick hug, practical questions, eyes evaluating my deplorable state. "Your mother told me roughly what happened," she said, while showing me the small room in the back where I would stay. "Here, no one will know anything about it. You start over, like so many people do in this city, starting over, as if it were that simple, like changing clothes or changing hairstyles, as if I could leave behind not only a place, but also everything that defined me until then." The first months in New York were a blur of gray and loneliness. Zoe got me a job at a clothing factory where she worked as a supervisor. I sat in front of an industrial sewing machine for 12 hours a day, sewing identical pieces one after another, fingers full of needle pricks, back aching, mind empty. At night, lying on the thin mattress in my little room, I would take out from under my pillow John's photos and the letters he had written to his father. I would reread each word until I memorized them, look at his smiling face until tears blurred my vision. It was my private morning ritual, my way of keeping alive something that everyone wanted me to forget. "You need to go out more," Zoe insisted on the rare Sundays when we didn't work. "Meet people, distract yourself. Staying in this room just looking at old photographs won't do you any good." But what she didn't understand, what no one could understand, is that I didn't want to feel good. Feeling good seemed like a betrayal of John, of our son who never got to be born, of everything we had lost. The pain was my only connection with them, and I clung to it like a shipwrecked person clings to a piece of wood in the open sea. 1967 arrived cold and gray. I turned 20 alone, without celebration, without even a phone call from the family I had left behind. The letters from my mother became increasingly rare, increasingly superficial. It was as if the physical distance had also created an emotional distance impossible to cross. It was around this time that I began to notice changes in my body. Beyond the physical scars from the attack, beyond the partially removed uterus that condemned me to never have children, I began to feel constant pain in my lower abdomen, irregular bleeding, fatigue that no rest alleviated. "You need to go to a doctor," Zoe said when she saw me doubled over in pain during dinner, my face pale as wax. "There's a government clinic here nearby. They attend for free." I resisted as much as I could. Doctors meant questions, meant explaining what had happened, meant reliving the trauma that I tried, unsuccessfully, to bury. But when the pain became unbearable, when I couldn't even stand in front of the sewing machine anymore, I had no choice. The diagnosis came cold, technical, impersonal. Chronic pelvic infection due to trauma in the reproductive tract, aggravated by inadequate scarring post-surgery. The doctor, a young man who barely looked me in the eyes, prescribed antibiotics, painkillers, and rest. "Rest is not an option, doctor," I said, thinking about the work I couldn't lose, the room I couldn't pay for if I lost my job. "I need to work," he shrugged, indifferent to my desperation. "Then you'll continue to be sick. You choose." I left the clinic more broken than when I entered. It wasn't just the body that was failing. It was life itself that seemed to conspire against me. Without family, without love, without health, without future. At 20, I felt like an 80-year-old, carrying a weight that bent me not only physically, but also in my soul. The medications helped for a while, but soon the pains returned, now accompanied by night fevers that left me soaked in sweat, trembling under the thin blanket. I lost so much weight that my clothes, already large for my body diminished by the tragedy, now seemed to belong to a completely different person. At the end of 1967, I almost fainted at the factory. I fell over the sewing machine, the needle piercing my hand, blood staining the white fabric I was sewing. I was taken urgently to the same public hospital where I had received the initial diagnosis. This time, the doctor was different. A middle-aged woman, tired eyes but kind, who examined me carefully and asked questions that no one had asked before. About the original accident, about the treatment received in Louisville, about how my recovery had been. "You have a serious infection that has spread," she explained after the exams. "We need to hospitalize you for treatment with intravenous antibiotics, and you'll probably need another surgery to remove damaged tissue." "I can't be hospitalized," I protested weakly. "I'll lose my job, my room. If you don't stay, you'll lose your life," she answered directly, but without cruelty. "The choice is yours, but I think you've already lost enough things to give up on this too." Something in the way she spoke, not with pity, but with a genuine understanding, broke the last barrier that kept me standing. I cried like I hadn't cried since I left Kentucky, sobbing like a lost child, letting out all the pain, all the fear, all the loneliness I had accumulated. The doctor waited patiently for me to calm down, without empty words of comfort, just a firm hand on my shoulder. When I finally managed to breathe normally again, she looked me in the eyes for the first time. "You're too young to give up," she said simply. "We'll take care of you now, and then you decide what to do with the life you still have ahead of you." I was hospitalized for almost 2 months. The infection was more serious than they initially thought, had spread to other organs, and my weakened body struggled to fight it. I went through 2 surgeries, had high fever for weeks, lost even more weight, floating between consciousness and delirium, where I saw John calling me, where I felt our baby kicking in the belly that was now empty and marked by scars. Zoe came to visit me a few times, bringing a change of clean clothes, telling news from the neighborhood without really expecting me to respond. On the 3rd visit, she brought the news I was already expecting. I had been fired from the factory. My room in the back of her house had been rented to another person. My few things were stored in a cardboard box. "When you get out of here, you can stay on my couch until you get settled," she offered, more out of family obligation than real desire to help me. "But you need to find something soon. Life is hard for everyone." When I finally received discharge in March 1968, I was a shadow of the person I had been. I weighed less than 90 pounds. My hair had fallen out in tufts during the fever. My face was so thin that my eyes seemed to jump out of their sockets. The doctor who had taken care of me gave me a list of medications I would need to continue taking, guidance on nutrition, and one last piece of advice: find something to live for beyond the pain. It can be anything: a job you like, a hobby, a pet, but find something, or the next time we meet will be in the morgue. Harsh words, but true. I was dying, not just physically, but inside. The spark of life that still remained in me was about to go out completely. Zoe's couch was uncomfortable, and her patience short. After 2 weeks of hearing hints about how I needed to figure things out, I found a job as a clerk at a bakery near the train station. The owner, a Portuguese man with a soft heart, took pity on my deplorable state, and offered me, besides the minimum wage, a small room in the back of the bakery where I could sleep. "The girl looks like she came back from war," he commented to his wife when he thought I wasn't listening. "I've never seen a person so worn out at such a young age." It was true. Looking in the small cracked mirror in the bakery bathroom, I barely recognized the person staring back at me. Where was the rosy-cheeked girl who smiled in John's photographs? Where was the young woman who dreamed of Paris, Rome, a life beyond the borders of Oakwood? All I saw was a ghost, dead eyes in a face that had aged decades in just 2 years. The work at the bakery was exhausting, but had its advantages. I started at 5 in the morning and finished at 7 at night, which meant I spent practically all my waking time occupied, with no space for dark thoughts. And there was always bread, coffee, sometimes even a piece of mortadella or cheese that was left over from the counter. Gradually, almost against my will, I began to gain weight again. The medications and regular food made the pains decrease, not disappear completely, but become tolerable enough that I could work without fainting. The hair began to grow back, still not as bright as before, but covering the scalp that had been exposed during the illness. It was at the bakery that I met Mrs. Margaret, a Portuguese lady who came every morning to buy fresh bread and stayed chatting a bit before returning home. She noticed my Midwestern accent, asked where I came from, showed genuine interest when I mentioned Kentucky. "My daughter lives in Louisville," she commented one day. "Married a Kentuckian and moved away. I miss her so much it hurts in my chest." I don't know what made me trust her. Maybe it was her maternal manner. Maybe it was the loneliness that had already lasted so long that it seemed part of me. Maybe it was simply the fact that I was tired of carrying alone the weight of my story. One morning, when the bakery was empty except for the two of us, I told her everything. Not the crueler details, but enough for her to understand why a 21-year-old girl seemed to have lived several lives of suffering. She listened in silence, teary eyes, holding my hand over the counter. When I finished, instead of offering empty words of consolation or, worse, pity disguised as understanding, she simply said, "Come have dinner at my house tonight. My husband is traveling for work, and I have too much soup to eat alone." That simple invitation was the beginning of a friendship that would save my life. Mrs. Margaret lived in a small but cozy apartment downtown, decorated with souvenirs from Portugal and family photos. On the walls, Catholic saints watched with kind eyes, and the smell of homemade food filled every corner. We had dinner together, talked about simple things, recipes, the weather, neighborhood news. She didn't touch on the subject of my tragedy again, didn't ask invasive questions, didn't offer advice I hadn't asked for. She just treated me like a normal person, something that hadn't happened in so long that I had forgotten what it was like. When I was leaving, she placed in my hand a small book, bound in worn leather. "Poems by Elizabeth Barrett Browning," she explained. "An English poet who also knew pain. Maybe she'll keep you company on nights of insomnia." I returned to my little room in the back of the bakery with the book pressed against my chest like a treasure. How long had it been since I had read anything besides medicine labels and product labels? Since John's letters, perhaps. Since the books that the teacher in Oakwood lent me secretly, before everything fell apart. That night, for the first time in years, I didn't sleep because of a reason other than pain or fear. I stayed awake reading Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poems, absorbing each word, each verse that seemed to speak directly to my wounded soul. "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach when feeling out of sight for the ends of being and ideal grace." The words of that woman who had died decades ago somehow reconnected me with something I had lost. Not just the love for John, not just the son who never got to be born, but the love for life itself, for the beauty that could still exist even after the worst of storms. Dinner with Mrs. Margaret was repeated the following week, and the next, and the one after that. Soon, I was spending my Sundays off at her house, helping make Portuguese cakes, listening to stories of her childhood in a village near Lisbon, learning to make bobbin lace during the long winter afternoons in New York. She never treated me with pity, never spoke of me as the poor thing or the girl of the tragedy. For her, I was just Martha, the girl from Kentucky who worked at the bakery, who liked poetry and had a knack for lace. It was this look, that saw not just my past, but also possibilities for the future, that slowly began to bring me back to life. In 1969, when I turned 22, Mrs. Margaret gave me a gift that would change the course of my existence. A complete sewing box with fine scissors, colored threads, needles of all sizes, and a business card. "My friend Catherine has a sewing studio in Greenwich Village," she explained. "She needs someone who knows how to do delicate finishes, laces, embroidery. I told her about you. If you want, you can start on Monday." The opportunity was unexpected and frightening. After years of just surviving, the idea of actually building something, of using a skill I had learned from my mother and perfected with Mrs. Margaret, seemed almost impossible to believe. "I don't know if I'm ready," I confessed, insecure. "No one is ever really ready for anything in life," she replied, with the simple wisdom she had. "We only discover if we're ready when we do it." The following Monday, trembling with nervousness, I presented myself at Catherine's studio. It was a small but elegant place, frequented by ladies from New York society who wanted exclusive clothes, handmade, different from the mass-produced dresses that were beginning to dominate the city's stores. Catherine was a robust Portuguese woman with quick hands and an appraising look. She examined my hands, asked me to do some embroidery stitches on a scrap, observed how I handled the delicate laces that adorned the party dresses. "Mrs. Margaret said you went through difficult times," she commented while I worked, concentrated so that my fingers wouldn't tremble. "She also said that she never met anyone with so much natural talent for needlework." I didn't answer, keeping my eyes fixed on the fabric between my fingers. The fear of failing, of disappointing, of losing one more chance was paralyzing. "Your past doesn't interest me, girl," Catherine continued, her voice firm but not unkind. "Your future interests me. And if you work as you're working now, you'll have a place here for as long as you want." Thus began a new chapter in my life, one that still carried the scars of the past, that was still marked by physical and emotional pains that would never completely disappear. But a chapter where, for the first time since the tragedy, there was a thin thread of hope, a possibility, albeit distant, that perhaps, just perhaps, I could find some meaning beyond the pain. Catherine's studio became my refuge, my sanctuary. Among silks and tools, among laces and embroidery, I found a purpose that kept me breathing, that made each new day bearable. It wasn't happiness. I doubt I would ever know that feeling again. But it was something close to peace, a truce in the battlefield that had been my existence. And in the silent nights, when I returned to the small room I now rented near the studio, I still took out from under the pillow John's photographs, the letters I kept as sacred relics. I still talked to him in whispers, still imagined how our son would be, who would be turning 3 if he had survived. The pain continued there, constant as breathing itself, but now I had learned to carry its weight without completely collapsing under it. It was a strange kind of survival, an existence that happened at the margins, in the shadows. I didn't live fully. I didn't know how to do that anymore, but I was no longer just waiting for death. I was somewhere between these two extremes, walking through a valley of shadows that seemed to have no end, but at least now I had strength to continue the journey, one step after another, day after day, carrying with me the ghosts of what could have been. The 1970s arrived in New York with the deafening noise of progress. The city grew like a hungry monster, devouring everything in its path. Old houses, century-old trees, traditions, memories. Buildings sprung from the ground almost overnight. Avenues extended, cutting entire neighborhoods. Concrete advanced relentlessly over any remnant of nature. I observed this transformation with the distance of someone who no longer feels part of the world. I was 23 in 1970, but I felt as if I had lived a century. The mirror showed a young woman, dark hair now recovered, the thin but no longer sick body, the skillful hands that created beauty with needle and thread. But inside, I was still that broken girl who fled from Kentucky carrying only pain and memories. Catherine's studio prospered, and I with it. From a simple assistant, I was promoted to main embroiderer, then to supervisor of the other girls who worked with the more delicate finishes. I had a natural talent that I didn't even know I had until then, a capacity to transform simple fabrics into wearable works of art. "Your fingers have magic," Catherine would say, examining a particularly intricate embroidery that I had just finished for a client's wedding dress. "It's as if the flowers were born from the needle." Perhaps it was true. Perhaps those embroidered flowers, those delicate laces, were the only truly beautiful thing I could still create in a world that had become so ugly for me. In 1972, Catherine made me an unexpected proposal. She was getting old, she said. Her hands were no longer as firm. Her eyes no longer saw the minute details of the most elaborate embroidery. She wanted me to become her partner, to gradually take over the studio she had built with so much effort. "I don't have children," she explained, sitting in the small back room where we had our snacks. "You are the daughter life gave me. I want my work to continue in your hands when I'm no longer here." The proposal scared me. Partner meant responsibility, meant commitment to the future, meant believing that there would be a tomorrow worth living. I wasn't sure if I was ready for that, if I would ever be. "I need to think," I replied, my voice trembling at the possibility that opened before me. That night, as I did in important moments, I took out John's photographs and the letters he had written to his father. I sat at the small table in my rented room, spread those relics of the past before me, and talked silently with the man I still loved, even after 7 years since his departure. "What would you tell me now, John?" I asked the photograph that showed me his smile frozen in time. "You who had so many dreams, so many plans for us, what would you say about this chance I'm receiving?" Obviously, there was no answer. Just the silence of the room, the distant noise of the city outside, and the familiar pain that never abandoned me completely. But as I looked at that face whose every line, every expression I knew, I remembered something he had written in one of the letters to his father. "Martha has a strength she doesn't know herself. She's like those trees in the desert that seem dry and dead in the drought, but that keep life inside them, waiting for the right time to bloom again." Is that what was happening? After years of emotional drought, was I finally finding a small sprout of life inside me? Not love, not complete happiness. I knew those feelings had been buried along with John and our son, but perhaps purpose, meaning, a reason to continue beyond the simple inertia of survival. The next morning, I told Catherine that I accepted her proposal. Her eyes filled with tears of relief and joy, feelings that I observed with the curiosity of someone who no longer remembers exactly how it is to feel them. "We'll change the name," she decided on the spot. "From now on, it will be Catherine and Martha's Studio. Soon, when I retire, it will be just Martha's Studio, my name on the front of a store. My name associated with something beautiful, with something I created instead of destroyed." It was such a strange concept that I could barely process it. The partnership with Catherine marked the beginning of a new phase. I learned about the business side of the business, about how to deal with suppliers, how to negotiate with demanding clients, how to manage the always tight finances. They were skills I never imagined I would develop, I who had been raised to be just a wife and mother in a small town. In 1975, when I turned 28, I was finally able to leave the rented room where I lived and rent a small but decent apartment not far from the studio. It was a simple place, 1 bedroom, living room, kitchen, and bathroom. But it was mine, conquered with my own work, with my own hands. It was around this time that I received the first letter from my mother after years of silence. The yellowed envelope, with the shaky handwriting that I recognized immediately, stayed on my table for days before I had the courage to open it. What could it say after so much time? What news would it bring from a life that seemed to belong to another person, from a family that had become just a distant and painful memory? When I finally opened it, the tears came before I even finished reading the first paragraph. "My dear daughter, I know it's been many years since we've communicated. The distance, the difficulties, the pain that we all carry, all of this created a wall between us that seemed impossible to tear down. But not a day goes by that I don't think of you, that I don't pray for your happiness, that I don't feel the emptiness of your absence at our table. I'm writing now because I finally got your address through Zoe, who ran into an acquaintance from New York. Also, because I feel that the years I have left are few, and I didn't want to leave this world without you knowing that I never, not for a second, stopped loving you." The letter continued, telling the news of the family, Joseph had gotten married, had 2 small children. Tony had moved to Louisville, worked in a government office. Grace was finishing her studies, dreamed of being a teacher. Life in Oakwood followed its course. People aged, babies were born, the elderly died. The town grew slowly, like everything in the interior. "I know your memories from here are painful," my mother wrote at the end. "I know that what happened marked your life in a way that may never completely heal. But I want you to know that if one day you want to return, even if just for a visit, you will always have a place in my house and in my heart. You are my daughter, and nothing, not even the worst of tragedies, can change that." I read that letter so many times that I memorized every word, every comma. It was a fragile bridge extended over an abyss that seemed impassable, a hand extended across time and distance. But I couldn't answer it. Not yet. The idea of reliving that pain, of putting into words everything that had happened since I left Kentucky, was too frightening. I kept the letter along with John's photographs, promised myself that I would respond when I was ready. But the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the letter remained unanswered, one more ghost to haunt me in the lonely nights. 1976 brought changes to the studio. Catherine, now almost 70 years old, began to gradually step away, coming only a few hours a day, leaving more and more decisions in my hands. The business prospered modestly. We would never be rich, but we had our loyal clientele, our constant orders for wedding dresses, party clothes, baby layettes for traditional families. It was also in this year that Mrs. Margaret, my first friend in New York, fell seriously ill. A cancer that spread too quickly, that consumed her robust body in a matter of months. I visited her at the hospital every day after work, bringing flowers, poetry books that we read together, news from the outside world that she could no longer see. "You were an angel in my life, Martha," she told me one September afternoon, her cold hand squeezing mine with what little strength she still had. "When I met you, I thought I was helping a lost girl. But it was you who filled the emptiness that my daughter's absence had left." "You were my angel," I replied, the tears I rarely allowed now flowing freely. "You saved me when I no longer wanted to be saved." She died that same night, quietly, as she had lived. At the funeral, small and sad, I realized I was the only person besides her elderly husband who truly mourned her, who would really miss her beyond social courtesy. I had lost not just a friend, but the woman who had been like a second mother to me, who had extended her hand to me when everyone else had turned their backs. That loss reopened wounds that had never really healed. In the months that followed, I began to have nightmares again about that afternoon in Louisville, to relive the attack, to feel the physical and emotional pain as if it had just happened. The chronic pains that doctors said were sequelae of the infections and surgeries returned in full force, sometimes leaving me bedridden for days. Catherine, concerned about my condition, insisted that I consult a specialist. "You're too young to live like this, like an invalid," she would say. "Medicine has advanced. There must be new treatments." Reluctantly, I agreed. The doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, listened to my medical history with unusual attention. He conducted thorough examinations, reviewed my history, consulted colleagues. "You have a condition called endometriosis," he explained when I returned for the results. "It's when tissue similar to the uterine lining grows outside it. In your case, it was aggravated by the trauma and the poorly performed surgeries you underwent years ago. Is there a cure?" I asked, although I already knew the answer from the tone of his voice. "Complete cure, no," he answered honestly. "But we can control the symptoms, improve your quality of life. There is a new surgery, less invasive, that can remove some of the more problematic sites, and hormone medications that help control the pain. Another surgery, more medications, more recovery time. The idea exhausted me even before I started. But what choice did I have? At 30, I lived like an old woman, counting the good days between crises that left me incapacitated, dreading each month the arrival of menstruation that brought with it waves of almost unbearable pain. "I'll think about it," I replied, getting up to leave. I was already at the door when the doctor spoke again. "Miss Martha," he called, his voice softer now. "I know you've been through things no one should go through. I know medicine failed you before, but don't give up. You still have a lot of life ahead of you. A lot of life ahead of you. The phrase echoed in my head for days. Was that what I wanted? More life? More years of loneliness, of pain, of memories that haunted me like sleepless ghosts? What kind of future could I expect, I who had been so deeply marked by the past? The answer came from an unexpected place. One afternoon, while I was working on a particularly delicate embroidery for a wealthy young bride's wedding dress, the client entered the studio for a fitting. She carried in her arms a small girl, no more than 3 years old, with golden curls and curious eyes. "I hope you don't mind," said the client, adjusting the child in her arms. "The nanny got sick, and I had no one to leave her with." I didn't answer. I was paralyzed, looking at that child who was exactly the age my son would be if he had survived. The same lively, curious look that I imagined he would have. The same easy smile that John had in the photographs I kept as treasures. "What a beautiful flower," the little girl suddenly said, pointing to the embroidery I was working on. "It looks real." Something inside me, something I thought had died a long time ago, moved at that moment. A warmth in my chest, a softness I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't happiness, not exactly. It was more like possibility, as if a door I thought was permanently locked had cracked open, letting in a sliver of light. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice hoarse with emotion. "Would you like to see how I make them?" The girl nodded enthusiastically, and her mother, surprised at my unusual receptiveness, sat her in a chair beside me. I spent the next hour showing her how the stitches transformed into petals, how the colored threads gave life to the white fabric. Her little eyes sparkled with fascination. Her innocent questions reminded me of a time when I, too, marveled at the small magics of the world. When they finally left, I sat for a long time, looking at the unfinished embroidery, feeling that strange emotion I couldn't name. It wasn't healing. I knew some wounds would never fully heal. It wasn't forgetting John, our unborn son, the violence that had destroyed our chance at happiness. All of this was still there, still part of me. It was something different, something like acceptance, perhaps, the understanding that I could carry that pain and still find small moments of beauty, of connection, of meaning, that the past didn't have to completely determine my future, that perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a purpose for me in this world, beyond simply existing in the shadow of what could have been. The following week, I scheduled the surgery. 3 months later, I started a night course in fashion design at a technical school near the studio. At Christmas that year, I finally answered my mother's letter, briefly telling her about my life in New York, asking about my siblings, opening a door that had remained closed for almost a decade. It wasn't a complete fresh start. It wasn't a magical erasure of everything that had happened. The scars, physical and emotional, were still there, some still painful to the touch, others just whitened marks of past battles. The nights still brought occasional nightmares. The anniversaries of John's death and the date when our son should have been born were still days of silent mourning. But there was also something new growing in the cracks of that broken heart, a resilience I didn't know I possessed. An ability to find small joys amid persistent pain. A strength that, as John had written so many years before, was just waiting for the right moment to manifest itself. The 1980s arrived, bringing with them new fashions, new challenges, new possibilities. The studio, now officially under my direction after Catherine's definitive retirement, adapted to the new times. I hired young, newly graduated designers. We expanded to a line of ready-to-wear clothes in addition to custom pieces. We set up a small annual fashion show that attracted our loyal clientele and potential new customers. At 33, I bought my first apartment, small but well located, decorated with the care of someone who finally accepts that they are building not just a temporary shelter, but a home. On the walls, besides John's photographs that I never stopped keeping, there were also works by local artists, images of places I dreamed of visiting one day, diplomas from the courses I continued taking to improve my skills. In 1983, I received a phone call that would once again change the course of my life. It was Joseph, my older brother, calling from Louisville with the news that, somehow, I had been expecting for years. Our mother was dying. The doctor says it's a matter of weeks, he explained, his voice choked by distance and emotion. She doesn't stop asking about you, Martha. I think she won't go in peace without seeing you one last time. 17 years had passed since I left Kentucky, swearing never to return. 17 years building a new life, trying to leave behind the horror I had lived there. The idea of returning, of facing those places loaded with terrible memories, terrified me. But it was my mother, the woman who had protected me as best she could, who had suffered her own version of that tragedy, who had lost her husband, however terrible he had revealed himself to be in the end. The woman who, despite everything, had never stopped loving me, even at a distance, even in the silence of years, without direct contact. I'll take the first bus tomorrow, I replied, the decision made before I even had time to think about all the implications. The journey back to Kentucky was like traveling through a time tunnel. Each mile traveled seemed to take me not only geographically back, but also emotionally, undoing layers of protection I had built over the years, reopening vulnerabilities I thought I had overcome. When the bus arrived in Louisville, Joseph was waiting at the station. I barely recognized him. The skinny boy who had accompanied me in my desperate escape was now a man of almost 40, with pronounced receding hairline in his dark hair and the same gentle look as our mother. The hug we exchanged was awkward, loaded with contradictory emotions. We were at once strangers and family, connected by blood and memories, separated by years and experiences we hadn't shared. She's at home, he explained while driving the old car through the streets of a Louisville I barely recognized, so different from the city I had left behind. She didn't want to stay in the hospital. Said she wanted to die looking at the backyard, at the plants she's been cultivating for so many years. My mother, when I entered the simple room where she was resting, I had to hold back a scream. The strong woman I remembered, even in the worst moments, had been transformed into a fragile, almost transparent figure against the white sheets. The hair, once black like mine, now completely white and thin. The face, a map of deep wrinkles that told stories of pain, hard work, constant worries. But the eyes were still the same. And when she saw me standing at the door, unable to advance, unable to retreat, they lit up with a brightness I thought I would never see again. "My daughter," she whispered, extending a trembling hand in my direction. "You came." I ran to her then, all hesitations forgotten, all barriers knocked down. I hugged that fragile body with all the care I could gather, feeling the bones almost at the surface of the skin, the heat of the fever that consumed her, the constant tremor that indicated how close she was to the end. "I'm here, Mom," I said, between tears I didn't try to contain. "I'm here now." I spent 2 weeks by her side, sleeping in an improvised chair next to the bed, leaving only to take a quick shower and eat what my sister-in-law prepared. We talked a lot during these days, about the past, about the lost years, about the wounds we carried, each in our own way. "I never forgave myself," she confessed one night, her voice so weak that I had to lean in to hear. "For not having protected you better, for not having seen the signs before it was too late." "There was no way to know, Mom," I replied, holding her hand in mine. "No one could imagine that he would go to such extremes. A father should protect his daughter, not destroy her," she said, her eyes fixed on a distant point, as if seeing beyond the walls of that simple room. "He wasn't like that when we got married, you know? He was a good man, hard-working. But something changed over the years, a bitterness, an anger that grew like a weed. It wasn't forgiveness that I felt for the man who had been my father. I don't even believe it's possible to completely forgive certain atrocities, but in those conversations with my mother, I found a kind of broader understanding. Not justification, never that, but an understanding that even monsters begin as human beings, that the line between humanity and cruelty is sometimes thinner than we would like to believe. My mother passed away on a Sunday morning, quietly, while I held her hand, as if she had waited only for my arrival, my forgiveness, not for what she had done, but for what she hadn't been able to prevent, to finally allow herself to rest. The funeral was simple, as her life had been. I reunited with my other siblings, met nephews I had never seen, received hugs from people in the community who still remembered me, some with looks of pity, others with poorly disguised curiosity about the girl who had left so many years ago and returned now as a stranger. I didn't go to Oakwood. I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I never would be. But before returning to New York, I asked Joseph to take me to a specific place in Louisville, the cemetery where John had been buried. Finding the grave was harder than we imagined. So many years had passed. So many other dead had joined that silent field. But finally, in a secluded corner under the shade of an ancient tree, we found the simple headstone with his name. John Miller, 1943-1966, beloved son, eternal in our hearts. There was no mention of me, of our interrupted history so brutally. Why would there be? For the world, I was just the girl who had been the indirect cause of his death, not the woman he loved, with whom he dreamed of building a life, with whom he expected a child. I knelt before that cold stone, placed the flowers I had brought, and finally said the words I had kept for almost 2 decades. Forgive me for not protecting you. Forgive me for being the reason for your death. Forgive me for surviving when you couldn't. There was no answer, of course. Just the gentle wind through the leaves of the tree, the distant song of a bird, the muffled noise of the city that continued its routine indifferent to my renewed pain. But somehow, in that moment of belated farewell, I felt something loosen inside me. It wasn't complete liberation. The chains of the past were too heavy for that. But it was as if a particularly tight knot had loosened a bit, allowing me to breathe more deeply for the first time in years. I returned to New York 3 days later, carrying with me old photographs that my mother had kept, letters I had sent and she had preserved as treasures, small reminders of a life that seemed to have belonged to someone else. I also carried something less tangible, a deeper understanding that we are all, somehow, prisoners and architects of our own destiny. The years that followed brought their own joys and sorrows. The studio continued to prosper modestly, now with a small team that allowed me to focus more on the designs and less on administrative issues. I maintained regular contact with my siblings, especially Joseph, slowly rebuilding bridges that I thought had been destroyed forever. The physical pains never completely disappeared. Doctors explained that it was the result of permanent damage, internal scars that no surgery could completely eliminate. But I learned to live with them, to recognize the signs of when I needed to slow down, to accept that certain limitations would always be part of my life. And here I am now, in 2025, at 78 years old, sitting in this comfortable chair in my apartment in Lexington, Kentucky, where I returned when I retired 5 years ago. The studio in New York continues to operate, now under the direction of a former apprentice who became almost a daughter to me. I returned to be close to my siblings, to the nephews who now have their own children, to this place that, despite all the painful memories, is still somehow my home. The scars never closed completely. On stormy nights, I still wake up startled, thinking I hear my father's voice, feeling ghosts of old pains. I still take John's photographs from the album, where I now keep them, still talk to him in whispers when loneliness weighs heavier. I still visit the cemetery where he rests, bringing flowers and words that only he could understand. But I learned, over these 60 years since the tragedy, that it's possible to live carrying pain, that scars, however ugly and deep they may be, are also marks of survival, that even a broken heart can still beat, can still feel, can still find small moments of peace amid the storm. It wasn't the life I dreamed of when I was that innocent girl in Oakwood, in love with the photographer with gentle eyes who promised to show me the world. It wasn't the life I imagined when I first felt my son moving inside me, when I planned a future full of possibilities that would never be realized. It was a life marked by pain, by loss, by absences that no time managed to completely fill. But it was also a life of small victories, of beauty created by my own hands, of human connections that, even fragile, reminded me that I was still part of this world. And if there's one thing I've learned, my dear viewers, it's that there is no pain so great that you can't carry for one more day, one more hour, one more minute, that even in the darkest nights, the sun eventually rises again. That scars, though they may never completely close, can be witnesses not only to our suffering, but also to our capacity to continue, to resist, to find meaning even after the worst of storms. Oh, and before ending this video, I would like to thank all of you who have followed my story to this point. If it touched your heart in some way, please leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear that. Even in the darkest moments, there is the possibility of moving forward. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. This old lady is very happy to know that her voice is reaching hearts in all corners of this vast America, and perhaps even beyond. God bless you, my dears. And remember, scars may never completely close, but it's possible to live, and sometimes even find beauty while carrying their marks.